there's a chance to kind of, in a brief format, an online format, just give you an idea of some of the things we're working on, some of the questions that come to us. Maybe it'll get some conversation going about questions you'd like to see answered. So without further ado, I'm going to launch into my portion. And as you know, as Rachel has talked about, feel free to put comments in the chat box. And also, we hope to have a few minutes to answer some questions at the end. So our first question, and Rachel will set up the question. We've been using real questions, or sort of slightly edited versions of other questions that we get over time. And the first question today is one I'll handle, about the question being, did we know that OPRF Art League formed 100 years ago? And the Historical Society helped commemorate this anniversary. And that's one of the great things about the kind of questions that come to us. Often for these big anniversaries, we either have things in the collection already, or the organization or business or whatever has a material they want to share. So it's a chance to kind of use a big round milestone to have that conversation, to the significance of some of these organizations, businesses, etc. And so we're of course, the Art League, an incredibly important local institution. I had years ago, when I was new at the Historical Society, when Marcia Palazzolo was involved as one of our board members, she later was president of the Art League, and heard a lot of stories about the great historical materials they had and the impact on the community. I myself am not particularly artistic, didn't have that kind of training or knowledge, so it was always interesting to hear about generations of kids around here who took art classes, who learned, maybe artists who kind of had a fellowship with their fellow artists. A lot of good that was done in the community, including bringing art into the schools through the years. So we, after a couple discussions, Jill Goldstein, the current executive director of the Art League, and Jeff Jenkins, who's sort of the jack of all trades at the Art League, does a lot of things there, and sort of the keeper of the historical records. We had some discussions, and Rachel and I are going to do a presentation next Wednesday, the 31st of March, and you can sign up for that whenever you'd like. Essentially, trying to cover the first 25 years using some of the materials in our collection, and actually having the opportunity to pour through the records, scrapbooks, and other things that the Art League has in its possession. And it has been fun, I think, for Rachel and I to kind of find out more, even though we knew some things about the Art League. The starting point for something like this is always to answer a question, to try to help somebody, is sort of real artifacts and objects. Like we have copies of the 1941 Art League book that shows a lot of the artists. It has a nice opening section talking about the history of the Art League, in that first roughly 20 years. And one of the things we're going to be focusing on next week, and I'll give you a little flavor of today, is kind of setting the stage for the Art League in 1921. The first meeting was held at in April of 1921, and so we're right on the cusp of the start of the anniversary year. And one of the things is that it was not a vacuum that the Art League sort of walked into, even though it's kept the flame going for 100 years and it's done some tremendous things. Is this community, Oak Park, Rare Forest, sort of even the far west side of Chicago, Austin, always had, I think, a strong artistic bent. I'm just going to share this great line from the 1898 Halley's Pictorial History of Oak Park. Of course, booster language, Oak Park's the best place ever. There's no place for anything that savors of discord or disorder. Saloons are excluded. The streets are always cleanly kept. The eye is ever pleased with the appearance of beauteous objects. And it goes on to say, after other incredible things about the community, talking about that every modern style of architecture prevails and pleases the imagination of the eye, and that there is an abundance of art, music, and literature to be found here. So there's this idea of sort of an artistic community. Yes, the fine homes, people had art, collected art, but they're also, I'm just going to focus on two people briefly, in this period of time before 1921, in the sort of 19th century, early 20th century, there were some great individual people that had national renown for their art. The first one I'm going to mention, and then we're going to switch the slide, is Frank Pebbles, or sometimes you can say Peebles, came here sort of after the Civil War, was a really renowned portrait painter, painted Supreme Court justices and President Grant, General later President Grant, and a number of other national figures. His brothers had a sort of paint and wallpaper type business in town in the 1870s and 80s and 90s. But he had his own studio and has kind of quite received a national reputation. His portraits in the OPR Public Library, some of you remember a really tall picture, the long picture of very vertical picture of James Scoville standing there. Frank Pebbles did that. Also, we have in the collection, when you walk into the museum today, Betty Kettle Strings. We also have a painting, pardon me, of Dr. Tope, the founder of Oak Park Hospital. So Pebbles did a lot of these sorts of things, ended up in California painting landscapes in sort of Southern California. So that was one person of national reputation that was here in the community and people talked about and knew about. Another person, just for another example, I'm not, this is giving you some examples, not going into great detail. If we change the slide, something that was a painting that was given to us by Laurel McMahon, a former president of the Historical Society, had it in her home in Austin and later in River Forest. This is a painting called Cousin Frances, 1893. This young woman came to Austin, visiting relatives during the World's Fair of 1893 in Chicago, and Josephine Reichman, who lived in River Forest from around 1890 to 1904, painted her. We have this sort of kind of a full-length portrait of this young woman, and it's kind of in the upper vestibule in the museum today. And it's this artist. She exhibited her work at the American Watercolor Society, the Art Institute of Chicago, a number of other places. Remember they also were in Hyde Park later on, and she was a member of the Southside Arts Association later in life. Her husband was a village trustee while she lived in River Forest. And in 1896, there's an article in the local paper. Reichman offered a limited number of courses in oil, watercolor, pastel, and china painting to River Forest residents in her home on Forest Avenue. Her daughter, also named Josephine Reichman, later took her husband's name, Increase Robinson, she's better known under that name. And Increase Robinson was head of the Federal Art Project in Illinois in the 1930s during the Depression, the famous WPA murals, et cetera. So again, a young girl who grew up in Oak Park later became a renowned artist herself. So I think there's this sense of the community having this artistic heritage that, you could go on and on with individual people and stories. But one thing before we get right to the Art League, when the Scoville Institute opened in 1888, there was an art collection. There was a lot of lectures on art. In 1898, they made they called it the Art Center, where they actually more formally had almost museum-like quality paintings, and that were, by local artists, and also some local stores, including Grable's, a picture gallery that lasted for many, many years. They also would in their window have local artists. So there was a sense of an artistic community. Fast forward to 1908, when there was a formal, only a brief organization, but a really kind of interesting organization called the Fine Arts Society that was formed in 1908. Charles White, the Prairie Style architect, the architect of Cheney Mansion and the Oak Park Post Office, among other things. They met in his studio right near Oak Park Avenue and Lake Street, kind of behind, between like Euclid and Oak Park Avenue, like behind Lake Street, like sort of back of the lot. He had a small studio, and it's really funny because this just one article from the Oakleys at the time talks about the membership of the new society will consist of active and associate members, the former to be carefully culled from the village highbrows. All active art workers, whether they have real genius or only merely talent, are eligible. That is, if the executive committee thinks that their work is up to the high standard. So there's this talk about that. A lot of stuff in the papers about their first show, and there seemed to be other architects. So they were sort of talking about all the fine arts together, and they even talked about arts and crafts, music, sculpture, painting, literature, so there was this sense of coming together. It's not quite clear why they don't last a few years, but they kind of did a lot of things in that time, a lot of art shows, etc. And when this organization, this Fine Arts Society, ended its couple-year run, before you knew it, you're into World War I era, and it was, obviously the war years, and not really as much focus on the need for art, although we always have a need for art, but in terms of having a formal organization. So after World War I, as the cusp of the Roaring 20s, what we now know as the Roaring 20s, there was this sense that we have to get back and have a more formal effort to support artists, to get art into the schools, to have lessons and all these good things. And if we switch the slide, a meeting was called by Carl Kraft at his home in Austin. He eventually moved to Oak Park a little bit later, but he was living in Austin at this time. And here's the Austinite. This is actually from the collection of the Oak Park Art League. And the idea of this annual, literally just, they form a meeting in early in the month, actually. And then they have the annual art exhibit. Talking about jumping right into it, not taking months and months to plan things. But it's this idea of, from the start, of having patrons, having people who maybe aren't artistic themselves but support the art community, individual artists, and sort of a collective effort as artisans and as artists. So this particular show is at the Grace Episcopal Church. The Art League, when it was organized, had sort of a period of years. We think of the Art League, those of us know even a little bit about it, think of their studio, their headquarters on Chicago Avenue, just east of Oak Park Avenue, set back from the street, beautiful lawn in front of it. It used to be the coach house for the Victorian house in the corner. It was designed by E. Roberts, who's also a member of the Art League and another architect of note. And there was this sense that that was a 1937-38 development. So the first 25 years, on the beginning of the 25 years, the Art League, it came together and right away started doing a lot of the things that we think of it now, having classes for kids, outreach to the schools, shows for its members, social events and activities, both as fundraisers and also to sell art of its members as a way to support the artist's work by selling their work after shows, etc. And it was really interesting just finding out some of that, the way that's talked about in the local press, and also how much from the start there's an attention and importance of this organization in Chicago broadly, and also the connections with a lot of sort of regional, statewide, even national arts organizations, cross membership, and people bringing in artists to talk and speak. One of the things that was really interesting in the Art League records are like an original ledger from 1921, talking about the dues paying into 22. Those of us here at the Historical Society and other people involved in not-for-profits, your annual dues to support the organization. And it's interesting, some of the artists that we, of course, know, like Carl Kraft, the founding president, who's known for his landscapes, including one we have here in the collection called Ozark Color. He also, in this ledger, I saw Josephine Reichman, the artist who was from River Forest, went to Chicago later, and she joined as sort of a charter member, it appears. Also, right next to her name was the artist J. Allen St. John. Those of you who aren't familiar with the name, he was the artist who did the first book art for the Edgar Rice Burroughs Tarzan stories, and he and Burroughs were kind of friends. He lived in the Tree Studios in Chicago for many years, and some people, he's kind of known in the sort of science fiction fantasy world as being a really premier artist of fantasy and science fiction type art, because of course Burroughs did a lot of sort of Martian stories, so the science fiction genre. So J. Allen St. John was right there at the start supporting his friends in Oak Park, even though he didn't ever live here, to the best of my knowledge. Also in the same ledger, at the bottom of the first page, was Laredo Taft. Those of you know Laredo Taft as a sculptor, the famous Black Hawk statue west in Oregon, Illinois, along the river there, and which has been restored in the last couple of years. Or at University of Chicago, I'm trying to think, it's called Fountain of Time or Hands of Time, that wall that is a sort of famous landmark in the Hyde Park area. So the idea of artists, yes, with Oak Park and River Forest residents, also with Austin residents, as I've said, it started as the Austin, Oak Park, and River Forest Art League. Also, from the start, early on in the 20s, they made an affiliation with a Maywood Fine Arts Association. And so they were sort of thinking regionally and involving people from different communities. So even though it's now called the Oak Park Art League, sort of Oak Park area, it had this sort of broader and sort of more regional approach to art. So I think the next slide, please. So I've just kind of tried to use the example of asking the historians when we get questions, even though I personally, Rachel, other people, key volunteers, and those associated with our organization have a lot of knowledge and a sense of historical connection around here, to actually delve in deep and try to find out more about these stories and put it in some sort of logical story to tell you all. Wanted to give you a sense of that, how we go about it. We go right to our files, to the material we have. If it's an organization that has an anniversary or something, what do they have to help tell that story? So it's really kind of a process. One final thing about the Art League, we think of it again, the 1930s, when it bought its current location. There were at a lot of other locations in the community, including the Frank Lloyd Wright Home and Studio. They actually rented for a period of time in the 1920s. The 19th Century Club, and a couple other locations. So some of these early stories before an organization really settles into its long-term home is also part of the story. The physical spaces and the sort of work that the organization did and does on behalf of the community. So that's a little bit about the Art League today at its 100th birthday. And now I'll turn it back to Rachel, who will tell you a very seasonal story that she's researched, and I'll flip it over to her.
Thank you very much. Here we are. So again, that's just a little bit of a backstory of the Art League and kind of an introduction to what we'll be talking about on our program this upcoming Wednesday. So on the screen, you can see where you can sign up for that. So I will go on to my question. My question for today that I'll be talking about is something that I get here and there, usually about this time every year, as people are thinking about planning their block parties. I get a few people who ask me, is my block party the oldest in Oak Park? And sometimes, and even just recently, I received this question, but it does not come in the form of a question. It's more of saying, I have heard from so-and-so, or I've been told throughout my childhood and my life that my block party is the oldest in Oak Park. Or very similar subjects. My something is the oldest something, or the first something. And that's always exciting to hear as a historian, but I always have to ask, how did you hear about that? And what sort of proof might you have? So that's usually our starting point for if I get a question like this, is what is your proof? That's always what we try to find. So I'm going to start a little bit with more of a backstory of block parties in Oak Park, especially because Oak Park has such a culture, such a rich culture of block parties. And myself, being from the south suburbs, I can tell you that it's not a thing where I grew up, and it's really a joy to see how many block parties have been an institution in Oak Park for each block for however long. And still going strong, even, with last year, some people had to cancel, some people had to do things very differently, but it's still such a sense of community and coming together to be able to have a good time with your neighbors. So my question that I want to focus on came from a person who told me that their block party started in 1958. And I want to start off by saying that this is what I am going to be claiming today as the oldest block party that I know about, because we have proof of when it started. So many people will tell me that their block party started around the late 60s and early 70s. And there's a very specific reason for that. In 1968 in Oak Park, just in the wake and the time of when they passed the Fair Housing Ordinance in Oak Park, and village government was really getting involved with ways to make the community more welcoming and bring people together in various ways. They started what was called the Oak Park Beautification Commission, and that was led at the time in the late 60s by Elsie Jacobson, So some of you who were on our Inside OPRF Museum last week know about her and know a little bit more about the Beautification Commission and all the sort of efforts that this group alone made at the time. They had dances, they had planting days where they would plant flowers around town. And one of the big things that they did was called 100 Block Clubs. So this would be their effort to form sort of a committee for each block where they would encourage people to make events or just various ways of talking to each other from house to house on a particular block. And with that, one of the biggest events that came from that effort was block parties, of course. So that's really when a lot of block parties started in earnest and became an annual thing. But back to the picture that you see and the question that I received a couple of years ago from this person who lives on the 1100 block of Wesley. He knew that his block party started annually since 1958. So thinking about that's 10 years prior to many of the ones that would have started in 68. Seems kind of like an anomaly. And again, I will say that this is the oldest one that I have heard of. So today I'm claiming that it might be the oldest one in Oak Park. And I want to give that as a precedence for all of you listening and for all of you in the future who are watching this. If you have sort of evidence that your block party is older than 1958, then please let us know, because this is really the only way that we can sort of find out some of these firsts, is getting it from the people who know. This particular block party was easy to document because it was written up in the newspaper, in the Oak Leaves, in September of 1958. And I have a quote from that article, which is kind of the basis for why I at least can believe that it was one of the first, if not the first. It said that the block scored such a success with this event that many believe such neighborhood gatherings might become an annual event. So again, that language itself just lends to the idea that this was one of the first and kind of a novel idea at the time. And they even say they had to ask the village to close off the street. So it was certainly something new at the time, but maybe not. So maybe you people listening know of a much older tradition on your block. So I encourage you to let me know. I want to leave you today with a little bit more about this party that might be some inspiration for your next block party. The newspaper says that they finished this event with a grand march led by a clown. And thanks to a collection of things that we have from a family named Trout who lived on this block, we have these fantastic pictures, and we actually have the clown. So very fantastic, in my opinion. That is pretty much all that I have. So I want to ask everyone if they have questions to put things in the chat box. And I will also encourage you, especially for my talk today, that if you have some comments, or if you know of some other block parties especially, to give me some information by email. You can find me on our website. And as far as what Frank talked about today, if this piqued your interest in the Art League, again, we are having a bigger program virtual on Wednesday night, this upcoming Wednesday, March 31st. That's in conjunction with the Art League, and you can sign up for that on our website as well. And we also do these monthly programs. Ask the Historians is the last Friday of every month, and Inside OPRF Museum is on the third Thursday of every month. So I really want to thank all of you on the call today who have been attending all of these, and please share and sign up for more. Let us know some things that you would like to see in the future. Obviously, if you have questions that you would like to be answered on Ask the Historians, then send that to us as well. So I think it doesn't look like we have any questions in particular. And I think that is all that I have for today's program. So I think unless Frank has anything to add, I will sign off for today. And thank you very much for coming.
Yes, thank you to everybody. And also, as Rachel just said, just to re-emphasize it, if you have a big, broad question about a topic or something that you'd like us to kind of deal with and answer a question specifically, don't hesitate. The only thing that we were trying to avoid is maybe tell me everything about my family or, you know, my individual property. But otherwise, if you have some broad questions about things like block parties or institutions like the Art League or other moments in history that you think you'd like to find out more about, we'll do our best to answer your questions. So thanks again.
All right, thank you all.